An 18-year-old girl married the enemy to get revenge, but her heart changed first. The wood of St. Jude Chapel groaned under the relentless Texas wind. Outside, the horizon was a bruised purple, swallowing the sun in a dusty haze. Inside, the air tasted of old incense and desperation. Clementine stood at the altar. Her wedding dress was an artifact of a dead life, ivory silk stained by the red clay of her father's ranch. Tucked into her bodice, hidden against her ribs, was a jagged shard of a broken porcelain plate. It was the only piece of her home left. The heavy oak doors swung open. Silas Thorne walked in. His spurs jingled with a rhythmic, predatory precision. He did not look like a groom. He looked like a storm draped in a duster coat, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow that erased his eyes. Behind him, the wind whistled, carrying the scent of rain that would never fall. He stopped 3 paces from her, the holster at his hip tied low. He looked at the altar, then at the girl who summoned him. "You sent a messenger to my camp, Clementine," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder over the canyon. "Most people run from me. You invited me here." Clementine did not flinch. She adjusted the veil that hung like a funeral shroud over her face. A single, withered wildflower was pinned to her hair, a reminder of the garden Silas's men had trampled. "Running is for those who still have something to lose," she replied. Her voice was steady, sharpened by weeks of practiced hatred. "I have nothing but this land. You have the guns to take it, but not the soul to keep it." Silas tilted his head, his gaze tracking the fire in her eyes. "The townspeople hate me. They call me a thief, a murderer." "They do." Clementine stepped forward, closing the distance until she smelled the tobacco and leather on him. "And they will fight you until the last man falls, unless you marry me. Marry the daughter of the man you replaced. Give me your name, and I will give you the town's submission. You will be a legitimate rancher, not a bandit hiding in the hills." She leaned closer, her whisper cutting the wind. "Marry me, and you will have the loyalty of this town. Kill me, and you will have nothing but an unmarked grave." Silas remained motionless for a long beat. The silence in the chapel was heavy, broken only by sand scratching against stained glass windows. Then a slow, grim smile pulled at his mouth. "A dangerous bargain, little bird," he murmured. "Do you know what you are asking for?" "I know exactly what I am doing," she lied. Silas turned to the priest, waiting in the shadows. "Start the service, Father. It seems I have a bride." The ceremony was a blur of Latin and sacred promises that felt like sins. When it came time for the rings, Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain gold band. He took her hand. Clementine felt a jolt of electricity. His hands were massive, calloused from reins and triggers. Yet, as he slid the ring onto her finger, his touch was impossibly light. It was a gentle, reverent caress that made her skin crawl with confusing warmth. She shivered. Not from cold, but from the realization that the monster had human hands. As she looked into his dark, unreadable eyes, Clementine felt the porcelain shard against her skin. She forced herself to remember the smell of smoke and the sound of her father's final breath. "My father taught me," she whispered as they turned to face the empty pews, "that the best way to kill a wolf is to let it carry you back to its den." Silas did not hear her. He led her into the dust-choked twilight, his hand guiding her toward a future built on lies. The Thorne estate sat like a tomb atop the jagged ridge, its stone walls weeping with the damp chill of the high desert. Inside the master bedroom, a candle fought a losing battle against the encroaching shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and dust. Silas left her there without a word, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway to fetch wood for the hearth. Clementine stood before a tattered silver-backed mirror. With trembling fingers, she unlaced the collar of her wedding dress, pulling silk away to reveal her left shoulder. There, etched into her pale skin, was a jagged, star-shaped scar, a permanent souvenir from a night the world had forgotten. But she lived every hour. As she stared at the mark, the cold stone walls seemed to dissolve into flames. She was 10 years old again. The smell of burning cedar choked her lungs. The screams of her mother were high and sharp, suddenly cut short by the roar of the wind. Through a crack in the cellar floorboards, young Clementine watched a man in a black duster coat stand in their yard. He was a silhouette of death against the inferno, a silver-engraved revolver glinting in his hand. He hadn't pulled the trigger on her, but he had stood there, an architect of her ruin, watching her world turn to ash. "Silas," she whispered to the empty room, the name tasting like poison. She reached into her dress and pulled out the porcelain shard. It was cold, sharp enough to sever a vein with a single stroke. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white, her eyes fixed on the door. She would wait until he slept. She would wait until the wolf lowered his guard in his den. The heavy thud of boots snapped her back to the present. Clementine spun around, hiding the shard behind her back, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The door creaked open. Silas entered, his frame nearly filling the doorway. He wasn't carrying a weapon. Instead, he balanced a wooden tray with a bowl of beef broth and thick, crusty bread. Draped over his shoulder was a heavy bear fur blanket. He didn't look at her directly. Sensing the terror radiating from her small frame, he moved to the hearth, kneeling to stoke the embers until a warm, amber glow bathed the room. "The wind up here bites deep," Silas said, his voice surprisingly soft. "You're shivering, girl. Eat. It's not poisoned." He placed the tray on a low table near the bed. Then, instead of approaching her, he took the heavy blanket and walked to the far corner, near the window. He sat on a wooden chair, leaning his head back against the stone wall. "I don't expect a thank you," he murmured, closing his eyes. "And I don't intend to touch you. A deal is a deal. You gave me your name. I give you my protection. That includes protecting you from me." Clementine watched him, her hand still clenching the shard behind her back. He looked tired. The firelight caught the gray at his temples and the deep lines of exhaustion around his mouth. He looked nothing like the monster from her memories, yet she knew the devil often wore a mask of kindness. He stayed there, a silent sentinel in the corner, settling in to watch the door for the night. He was guarding her, or perhaps he was simply waiting for the dawn of a new, bloodier day. Clementine remained standing by the mirror, a bride with a knife, watching the man she had sworn to kill as he drifted into a light, watchful sleep. The winter sun rose over the prairie like a pale, frozen coin. The air was so dry it stung the lungs, and a thin layer of frost clung to the brittle buffalo grass. Clementine stood in the makeshift kitchen of the ranch house, her hands trembling as she held a small paper packet. Inside was a bitter powder of crushed oleander seeds, a slow, silent killer. Silas was outside, saddling his horse. She watched him through the grime-streaked window. This was the moment. She tipped the powder into his blackened tin cup, stirring it into the thick, chicory-scented coffee. 1 cup, and the man who haunted her nightmares would be gone by sunset. Suddenly, a frantic neighing shattered the morning silence. Clementine ran to the porch. Down by the edge of the creek, a young mare had wandered into a patch of freezing quicksand. The animal was thrashing, its eyes rolling in terror as the gray muck swallowed its belly. Silas didn't hesitate. He dropped his gear and ran toward the mud. "Stay back, Clementine," he barked, already waist-deep in the treacherous slush. She watched, breathless. her hand clutching the porch railing. She expected him to use a whip or a rope to drag the beast out by force. Instead, Silas leaned in close to the horse's ear. He began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to cut through the animal's panic. "Easy, girl," he whispered, his voice a gentle caress. "I've got you. Just breathe with me." The mare's frantic splashing slowed. Silas dug his arms deep into the biting cold mud to loop a harness beneath the horse's chest. As the animal struggled, its sharp hoof lashed out, catching Silas across the forearm. Blood bloomed instantly, staining his wool sleeve a deep crimson. He didn't even flinch. He ignored his own pain, his focus entirely on the trembling creature until, with one final, agonizing heave, the mare scrambled onto solid ground. Silas collapsed on the bank, gasping for air, covered in filth and blood. He didn't curse. He didn't strike the horse. He simply reached out a mud-caked hand and stroked the mare's velvet nose, his eyes shining with a profound, weary kindness. It was an expression of pure soul, a look that belonged to a healer, not a butcher. Clementine stood frozen. Her gaze drifted back to the tin cup sitting on the table inside. Silas limped back toward the house, shivering violently. He sat on the porch steps, clutching his wounded arm. Clementine emerged with a tray, her heart a chaotic drum. She had the coffee, but she also brought a plate of fried salt pork and a fresh biscuit, the best of their meager rations. Silas looked at the food, then at her. He pushed the plate toward her. "You eat the meat, Clementine," he said, his teeth chattering. "You're thin as a rail. I'll settle for the crust." He took a piece of dry, stale bread from his pocket and began to chew it slowly. He picked up the tin cup, the one she had laced with death, and raised it to his lips. Clementine's breath hitched. She saw the blood dripping from his sleeve, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the selflessness of a man who would bleed for a horse and starve for a stranger. "Wait," she cried, her voice cracking. Before he could take a sip, she reached out and swiped the cup from his hand, sent it tumbling into the dust. The poisoned coffee soaked into the parched earth, bubbling for a second before disappearing. Silas blinked, startled. "What's gotten into you?" It was cold," she stammered, her face flushing. "I'll make you a fresh pot." She turned and fled back into the house, her mind a storm of confusion. The monster was supposed to be easy to hate, but how could she kill a man who possessed more humanity than the world that had abandoned her? The heavy oak door to Silas's study had always been a forbidden frontier. It was the only room in the house that remained locked, a silent sentinel at the end of the hallway. To Clementine, it was the sanctuary of a devil, a place where he surely kept the ledgers of his sins and the maps of his conquests. One afternoon, while Silas was out patrolling the southern fence line, Clementine found the door ajar. The wind must have teased the latch loose, or perhaps, subconsciously, Silas had stopped hiding. She slipped inside. The room smelled of old paper, gun oil, and the faint, lingering scent of the lavender soap she used, a scent he had evidently carried in on his clothes. Her eyes darted across the desk until they landed on a heavy iron box tucked beneath a stack of land deeds. "This is it," she whispered, her heart hammering. "The proof." She used the shard of porcelain to jimmy the simple lock. It snapped open with a sharp metallic protest. But inside, there were no lists of targets, no gold teeth taken from dead men. Instead, there were stacks of letters. Clementine picked one up. It was addressed to a widow in Abilene. She opened it, and a few crumpled banknotes fell out. "For the education of your son," the letter read in Silas's cramped, labored handwriting. "A debt that can never be fully repaid for the shadow I helped cast over your home. I was a man without a choice then, but I choose this now. There were dozens of them. Letters to mothers, to orphaned children, to broken farmers. They weren't just correspondence, they were confessions. Silas hadn't been spending his wealth on power. He had been bleeding himself dry to buy back the souls of the people his former gang had crushed. He hadn't been the leader. He had been a tool, a man forced into a life of violence, now spending every waking hour trying to mend the world he had once helped break. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel, lay a small, faded photograph. Clementine's breath hitched. Her knees hit the floorboards. It was her family. Her father, looking stern yet proud. Her mother, with that soft, lopsided smile. And a 10-year-old Clementine, clutching a rag doll. The edges of the photo were worn thin, as if they had been rubbed by a thumb thousands of times over the years. On the back, a single date was written, the night of red smoke. Underneath it, Silas had written 3 words that shattered Clementine's world. The child lived. I must find her. He hadn't been the one who killed them. He had been the one who watched her from the shadows, unable to stop the carnage, but vowing to find the survivor. He hadn't married her to steal her land. He had married her because he had finally found the girl he had been searching for to protect. You weren't supposed to see that. Clementine gasped, spinning around. Silas stood in the doorway. He didn't look angry. He looked exposed, his face stripped of the rugged mask he wore for the world. He looked like a man standing before his judge. "You've been paying them," she choked out, holding the photograph. "All these years. Why?" Silas leaned against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the picture in her hand. "Because a man can't outrun his shadow, Clementine. He can only try to light enough fires to make it disappear." The porcelain shard in her pocket felt like 1,000 pounds. The man she had come to kill was the only person in the world who had been grieving for her family as long as she had. The sky over the valley didn't just turn dark, it turned bruised. A violent, greenish-black wall of clouds swallowed the ridge, and then the heavens broke. Rain lashed against the ranch house like handfuls of gravel. Lightning ripped the sky open, illuminating the yard in terrifying, strobe-like flashes. Inside the study, the air was suffocating. Clementine still held the photograph, her world tilting on its axis. Silas took a step toward her, but a sudden, sharp crack, louder than the thunder, echoed from the front porch. The front door splintered inward. "Silas, come out and face your ghosts, you traitorous dog." The voice was jagged, like glass grinding on metal. Silas stiffened. He instinctively shoved Clementine behind his desk. "Stay down," he hissed. "Don't move. Don't breathe." He drew his revolvers and stepped into the hallway. Standing in the ruin of the doorway was a man drenched in rain, wearing a tattered duster coat. Behind him, 4 shadows loomed, men with rifles, their eyes hollow and hungry. This was Julian Vane, Silas's former second-in-command. "Vane," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal growl. "You're a long way from the hole you crawled out of." Vane laughed, a wet, hacking sound. He pointed a trembling finger at Silas, then looked toward the hallway where Clementine was hiding. "I heard you went soft, Silas. Heard you married the little brat from the Blackwood place," Vane sneered. He wiped rain from his eyes, his grin widening. "Does she know? Does she know you tried to grab my arm when I put the bullet in her father's skull? You screamed like a woman, Silas, begging me to stop. But I liked the way the fire reflected in their eyes." Clementine's heart stopped. He was the one, not Silas. Silas had been the voice she heard, pleading in the dark. "You were always a rabid animal, Julian," Silas said. He stepped forward, purposely blocking Vane's line of sight to the study. And animals need to be put down. Maybe, Vane shrugged, clicking the hammer of his carbine. But I brought friends. We've come for the land, and we've come for the girl. Move aside. Silas didn't move. He stood in the center of the narrow hallway, his boots planted firm. He looked back over his shoulder for a split second, his eyes finding Clementine's through the doorway. There was no fear in him, only a quiet, devastating resolve. "The only way you get to her," Silas shouted over a roar of thunder, "is over a mountain of my brass." Vane's men raised their rifles. The hallway was too narrow to dodge. Silas didn't even look for cover. He became a human shield, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the door. "Silas, no!" Clementine screamed, reaching out. Silas didn't turn back. "Marry me, and you will have the obedience of the local people." He quoted her words from the wedding, his voice thick with an unexpected, tragic warmth. "But I didn't marry you to own you, Clementine," he roared as Vane leveled his gun. "I married you to have a rightful reason to die in your place." Flash. The hallway exploded in gunfire. Lead chewed into the wood. Silas's guns barked back, two streaks of orange flame in the dark. He took a hit to the shoulder, then another to the thigh, his body jerking with the impacts, yet he refused to fall. He stood his ground, a bleeding titan between the girl and the monsters of her past. The storm outside howled, but inside, the sound of a man fighting for his soul was louder than any thunder. The storm outside had settled into a rhythmic, grieving drizzle. Inside the house, the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid sting of burnt gunpowder. Silas lay propped against the base of the bed, his face as pale as the moon. His duster coat was shredded, soaked through with a terrifying crimson. He had held the hallway long enough for Vane's men to retreat into the night, but the cost was etched in the jagged holes in his flesh. Clementine knelt over him, her wedding dress ruined, the white silk now a map of red stains. She was cutting bandages with the same porcelain shard she had intended to use on his throat. Her hands, once steady with the cold resolve of an assassin, were now shaking uncontrollably. "Hold still," she choked out, a sob breaking her voice. "Please, Silas, just hold still." Silas let out a jagged breath, his eyes fluttering open. Even in his agony, his first instinct was to reach out with a trembling hand to brush a stray, bloody hair from her forehead. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice barely a rasp. That's all that matters." The kindness in his voice was the final blow. The hatred Clementine had nurtured for 8 years, the fire that had kept her warm in the coldest nights, suddenly flickered and died. She collapsed against his chest, the porcelain shard clattering to the floor. "I was going to kill you," she confessed, the words pouring out in a frantic, weeping torrent. "Every night, every meal. I had poison in your coffee. I had a blade under my pillow. I hated you for every breath you took while my father took none." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he took her hand, the one that had held the poison, and pressed it firmly against his chest, right over his laboring heart. "I knew," he murmured. A faint, tragic smile touched his lips. "I saw the way you looked at the knives. I smelled the oleander." Clementine looked up, her eyes wide and blurred with tears. "You knew? And you still drank? You still protected me?" Silas's grip on her hand tightened. "I don't blame you. If dying by your hand could have given you peace, I would never have regretted it." He coughed, blood flecking his lips, but his gaze remained locked on hers with an intensity that burned. "I've lived a long time with blood on my hands, little bird. If my life was the price for your smile, it would have been the best trade I ever made." Clementine leaned in, her forehead resting against his. The world outside, the vengeance, the ranch, the ghosts of the Blackwoods, all of it faded away. There was only the heat of his skin and the desperate, fragile beat of his heart. She pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a soft kiss. It tasted of salt, iron, and the desperate hunger of two drowning souls finding a life raft in each other. It was a seal of forgiveness, a silent vow that the war was over. In the wreckage of the room, amidst the smell of blood and gunpowder, the enemy had died and a husband had been born. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered against his lips. "You owe me a lifetime of living, Silas Thorne." Weeks bled into months. The harsh winter gave way to a fragile spring. Silas's wounds eventually turned into scars under Clementine's care. But while his body healed, they both knew the ghost of Julian Vane was still out there, waiting. The war wasn't over. The town of Black Creek was a skeleton of wood and dust, abandoned years ago to the rattlesnakes and the ghosts. Tonight, it belonged to Julian Vane. He sat in the rotting remains of the saloon, surrounded by his men, convinced the storm had finished what he started. He was wrong. Outside, the silhouette of a woman moved through the shadows, with the grace of a mountain lion. Clementine no longer wore the ivory silk of a victim. She had replaced it with rough leather pants, dusty boots, and Silas's gray duster. On her hip, 2 Colt revolvers gleamed in the moonlight. Silas crawled across the street, his wounds tightly bandaged, his eyes cold and sharp. He wasn't leading. Tonight, he was the shadowy figure providing cover. He trusted her. "Now," Clementine whispered. Silas fired a shot into a barrel of kerosene near the stables, creating a wall of fire that drew Vane's men outside. As they scrambled in confusion, Silas's rifle sang from the shadows, picking them off with surgical precision. Clementine didn't waste a single bullet on the henchman. She kicked the swinging doors of the saloon open. The hinges screamed. Julian Vane spun around, dropping his bottle of whiskey. He reached for his gun, but Clementine was faster. A bullet hissed through the air, shattering Vane's hand before he could even touch his holster. He fell back against the bar, howling, clutching his ruined fingers. Clementine walked toward him, each step heavy and deliberate. She didn't look like an 18-year-old girl. She looked like the angel of death. "You," Vane gasped, his face twisted in agony. "You should be dead in that cellar." "I died in that cellar 8 years ago," Clementine said, her voice as cold as a winter grave. "I'm just here to make sure you join me." Silas appeared in the doorway, his rifle lowered. He didn't intervene. He stood there like a wall of stone, ensuring no one else entered. He looked at Clementine, a silent nod of encouragement. This was her moment. Her demon to slay. Clementine stood 3 paces from the man who had shattered her childhood. She leveled her revolver at his forehead. The hammer clicked, a small sound that felt like a thunderclap in the silent room. "Silas tried to stop you," she said, her eyes burning. "He spent his life trying to fix what you broke. But some things can't be fixed. They can only be ended." Vane looked past her at Silas, his voice a pathetic whine. "Silas, help me. We were brothers." Silas didn't blink. "I have no brother. I only have a wife, and she is the judge today." Vane looked back at Clementine, seeing the utter lack of hesitation in her gaze. He realized too late that he hadn't been fighting a girl. He had been fighting the consequence of his own cruelty. "Please." "For my mother," Clementine said. Bang. "For my father." Bang. The last shot echoed through the empty town, lingering long after Vane's body hit the floorboards. The silence that followed was deafening. Clementine stood there, the smoke curling from her barrel, her chest heaving. The weight that had crushed her heart for nearly a decade didn't disappear instantly, but the fire, the burning, agonizing need for blood, finally went out. She turned toward Silas. Her hand was shaking now, the adrenaline fading. Silas walked over, not saying a word. He took the heavy gun from her hand and tucked it into his own belt. Then, he drew her into his arms, shielding her face from the sight of the man on the floor. "It's over, Clementine," he murmured into her hair. "The ghosts are gone. Let's go home." The scent of damp earth and blooming sagebrush filled the air. The storm had passed, leaving the valley scrubbed clean and vibrant. Golden sunlight spilled over the Blackwood Ranch, turning the dew on the grass into a sea of diamonds. It was a morning that felt less like a continuation of the past and more like the first day of a new world. Clementine and Silas stood near the old oak tree where her family used to picnic. A small fire crackled in a stone pit between them. One by one, Clementine fed the letters from the iron box into the flames. She watched the ink of old sins and the paper of ancient debts curl into black ash, carried away by the gentle prairie breeze. The weight of the porcelain shard was gone from her pocket. She had buried it near the porch. A piece of the past finally returned to the earth. Silas stood by his horse, his saddlebags packed. He looked healed, but his eyes carried a lingering shadow of doubt. He reached into his duster and pulled out a rolled parchment, the legal deed to the ranch, now bearing only one name, Clementine Blackwood. "It's yours," Silas said, his voice thick with a quiet solemnity. "The land, the cattle, the house, it's all returned to its rightful blood." He handed her the papers and took the reins of his horse. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon. "I've done what I could to mend the fences, Clementine," he murmured. "But a man like me, I'm a reminder of the smoke. You deserve a horizon that doesn't have my shadow crossing it. I'll be gone by noon." He turned to mount his horse, his movements heavy with the expectation of a lonely road. But before his boot could hit the stirrup, Clementine's hand shot out. She didn't grab his sleeve. She gripped the leather reins, pulling the horse back with a fierce, unwavering strength. "You're a fool, Silas Thorne," she said, a small, defiant smile breaking through her tears. Silas froze, looking down at her. "I'm a man who brought you nothing but grief." "No." Clementine stepped closer, placing her hand over his on the saddle. "You're the man who stood in a hallway and took lead for a girl who wanted you dead. You're the man who kept a photograph for 8 years because you couldn't forget a soul you thought was lost." She looked out over the sprawling green hills, the land that was once a graveyard, now a garden. "I don't want the ranch without the man who saved it," she whispered. "The deed says the land is mine, and as the owner, I'm telling you, stay." Silas searched her face, finding no trace of the assassin, only the woman who had learned that mercy was the ultimate power. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension of a decade finally leaving his shoulders. He let go of the reins and stepped down, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, two broken people stitching themselves into a whole. The frontier was still wild, and the road ahead would be hard, but they were no longer walking it alone. "Hatred is a burden," Clementine whispered, leaning her head against his chest as they watched the horizon. "Hate is a burden, but love, it is the wings that carry us across this desert." Silas held her tighter, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look back at the shadows. He only looked forward, into the light. And so, the dust settles on a ranch, once fueled by vengeance, now blooming with a love as vast as the Texas sky. Clementine and Silas's story reminds us that even in the harshest frontier, the heart can find a way to heal. If you felt the heat of the desert and the sting of their journey, Leave a comment below. Would you have forgiven the man who wore the face of your enemy? Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where passion meets gunpowder. Until next time, keep your secrets guarded and your aim true.